There is no way they actually read the bills before they threw around all of their faux outrage.
It seems like that they're just jumping on the bandwagon and creating this hysteria. So actually, let's take a look at the perception versus reality.
You mean facts? Crazy.
Yes.
Wow. Let's
Facts
actually,
first.
yeah.
Well, here's what the Georgia voting laws looked like previously before this law. Absentee ballots were verified with a voter signature. Number 2, there were no secure absentee ballot drop boxes in place. Number 3, it restricted weekend voting. Early voting for runoffs have 3-week early voting period. Number 5, the deadline to request an absentee ballot was 180 days before the election. Number 6, counties were required to certify election results within 10 days. And number 7, the public was allowed to distribute food and water to voters in line.
All right. Well, that's how it used to be, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about what's actually in the bill, the changes that the Republicans made and that Democrats and all those folks are up in arms about. So let's look. Number 1, absentee ballots now have to have a verified ID. Oh, my gosh. You actually have to have a driver's license or some form of valid ID, Lindsay. This is insane. I see what the left's all up in arms about. I mean, you actually have to show ID. I mean, it's like you want government benefits or you want to get on a plane or you want to have a vaccine passport. All of those things that the government normally has that none of the folks on the left get upset about.
Yeah. Well, the crazy thing about this, too, Sean, is the left keeps saying that this is voter suppression. But how do they know if it's voter suppression if you're not requiring an ID to know if these are even voters in the first place if you're not checking an ID?
That's right. I mean, it's amazing that all these other things, they're so concerned about making sure you have an ID for, but not voting. That's the only thing they make an issue of. Why? Why? Why is that the only thing? And you've got to ask yourself that question because it defies common sense. All right, let's go back to the list. Keep going down this thing. Ballot drop boxes are allowed inside early voting locations and available during business hours. Okay, so based on before, they weren't. Now they are. That should please the left, right? Weekend voting expanded for the general election. Oh, more weekend voting. Again, that's something the left should like. Interesting. 4, voting for runoffs reduced to a minimum of 1 week. Okay, that's good. Deadline to request absentee ballots, 11 days before the election. I thought you just said a minute ago it was like 180, so now it's actually giving more people access. And now counties will be required to certify an election within 6 days, which I think, frankly, gives voters more confidence in an election that they know isn't going to get dragged on and it's got to actually force these guys not to go home in the middle of the night like they did last time. And 7, the public is prohibited from distributing food or water to voters within 100 feet of the polling locations. This is the one provision, Lindsay, that's getting all the attention. The left is trying to make this all about the water. If you're in line and you're about to pass out and die, no water for you. That's just not simply true. And if you watch those Sunday shows, they frankly lied. It's within 150 feet. If you're at 151, which is not a lot, remember what 150 feet is before you get in, then you can bring water, you can hand off water, you can hand off food, you could get like a 5-course meal if you wanted. It has to do with people getting close to the voting booth and not allowing them to actually persuade.
Yeah, and a lot of times, Sean, when people are handing out water, it has a candidate's name on it. They're wearing a candidate's name shirt, something like that. And so it's absurd. If you're, like, to your point, if you're within 150 feet, you're almost voting at that point.
Yeah, and it's funny, most states have something like this, but let's look at what the bill, I guess the law now, actually says. This is from Section 33. This is what everyone's all up in arms about. It says no person shall solicit votes or distribute or display any campaign material, nor shall any person give, offer to give, or participate in the giving of any money or gifts, including but not limited to food and drink, to a voter. This code section shall not be construed to prohibit a poll officer from making available self-service water from an unintended receptacle to a voter waiting in line, i.e. if there's a drinking fountain or some kind of water jug in the corner with the little cups that we see all over the place, you can go do that. What is preventing, and what the law clearly is about, is trying to stop people from influencing them and buying their vote or attempting to get them to do something in return for something as they get closer and closer. As I said, this is all about 150 feet within the voting thing, and most states have something, right?
Yeah, a lot of states do. As you mentioned, there's actually, most states already have similar rules. Here's just one example of that. In Montana, they have a 100-foot rule, so less, that says this: candidates their families and their campaign workers, volunteers, cannot distribute alcohol, tobacco, food, drink, or anything of value that isn't rolling back access to voting, as the Democrats say. You know, it's interesting, Sean, because they're actually trying to work to ensure eligibility for these people and that everyone has voting access. But the fact that people are freaking out about the water is so insane here.
Well, they had to find something, because the irony is, if you actually read the bill, it actually helps codify. Remember, we had a global pandemic, and so there were a lot of accommodations that were made, right, because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so the state went back and actually said, okay, what can we do to keep some of this, to expand some of this, to actually make some of this law? And people forget, had it not been for that, had they done nothing, there would be no drop boxes, there would be none of this stuff, because that was only done because of the pandemic. And it's so dishonest for these folks in the media and these folks on the left to try to make it look like something's being restricted. So many of those things that we just read, they're actually in the law, expand the ability for people to vote. And it's so unbelievably dishonest for these guys to sell it the way they are.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.